no, we are not headed for 5 or 6 degrees of warming. And actually, it's not too late to make a difference here. Like, I think the key misconception there is this notion that there's some point of no return. And actually, some people think that point of no return, or they assume that point of no return is 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. The notion that we're suddenly going to go from 1.5 to 5 degrees within a decade or a couple of decades is not the case. If you look at the speed at which we can deploy many low carbon sources of energy now, in particular solar and wind, they're growing incredibly fast and much, much faster than we've deployed any energy source in history.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Hello and welcome. Today we've got Hannah Ritchie, who's Deputy Editor of Our World in Data and also runs Substack Sustainability by Numbers. We love numbers and data, and that's why we're delighted to have Hannah back for a second time. Plus, she has a new book out called Clearing the Air, a hopeful guide to solving climate change in 50 questions and answers. So I thought producer Rob, who was just asking me what today's big idea might be, that rather than having a single bad idea that Hannah's saving the world from, there's probably 50 because, you know, Hannah, tell me whether I'm right, but it seems to be like a lot of the time, the wrong answers to the questions that you pose in the book are the ones that are most popular and most widespread, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, we actually try to work out the best framing for the book. Is it questions, or as someone rightly pointed out, like a lot of these are myths, or what I might frame as half-truths, where there's some seed of truth to them, but the context is missing to understand them. But yeah, like the 50 questions are generally the 50 most common arguments I get against many of the climate solutions that I think we need and the world needs to tackle climate change. So yeah, I think that's probably a pretty accurate framing.
Is that okay then, producer Rob? If we have 50 bad ideas that's Hannah saving the world from. Well, we don't have time to obviously go through all 50, but I thought what we could do is, I mean, there's 10 basic sections, and you're going from climate, fossil fuels, renewables, nuclear energy, geoengineering. And maybe we'll take one or two questions from each section and see how much we can get through in the next hour. If you want the full Q&A, of all 50, you'll have to buy the book. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds good. I should say I also did not know what the bad idea I was showing up to argue against was. So
I like to keep it as a surprise, mostly because I haven't thought about it in advance. All right, let's kick off. The first one from the climate section, which is the way you start the book, obviously you're sort of setting out the kind of landscape of where we are with climate change. The question of, isn't it too late? You know, the sort of doomsterism, the pessimism, and in fact, you put it, aren't we heading for a 5 or 6 degree warmer world? So what's your current thinking on that?
I mean, the book is pretty much framed around climate solutions, but I thought the very first question to answer, and one of the most common questions that I get asked is there even any point in paying attention to what's the cost of renewable energy or how much land will it need? Because whatever we do won't make a difference anyway, because we're kind of at the point of no return on climate, and we're kind of heading for this scenario of 5 or 6 degrees of warming regardless, this kind of doomsday type thinking. And the first question is really saying, no, we are not headed for 5 or 6 degrees of warming. And actually, it's not too late to make a difference here. I think the key misconception there is this notion that there's some point of no return. And actually, some people think that point of no return, or they assume that point of no return is 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And therefore, now that we are basically at 1.5 degrees or very close to it, we're kind of get tipped into this runaway climate scenario, and there's no point in us taking action and looking at the other 49 questions in the book on how we actually solve this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a bit of this conversation with Roger Pilker Jr., actually, that, you know, just reminding people that 1.5 and indeed 2 were political targets. It wasn't like the scientists ever came to the policy community and said, hey, guys, we've discovered a huge number of tipping points at 1.5, therefore you need to have this as the Paris goal. It actually emerged the other way around, and I think 1.5 is a suspiciously round number, as people have said.
Right.
Same with 2 degrees. It wasn't like 7.3, or something where you'd actually, have the scientists making a very precise prediction. So we just don't know where most of these tipping points are. But the scientists, of course, then came around and did a whole study in the IPCC with 1.5. But it worked that way around. Policy first, so this was a political number, and then the science then came in behind. But it doesn't look like there's, we're going to lose the Amazon, or we're going to lose the AMOC, the Atlantic current, or even big ice sheets at 1.5, does it?
No, not at 1.5. To be clear, there are tipping points there, and we don't know where they are. And the tipping points, I think there's two aspects to them. One is the kind of physical consequences of that particular tipping point. Like the AMOC shutting down would have pretty large consequences for climate in large parts of the planet, but in particular in Northern Europe. But then there's another dimension to, I think, tipping points, which is the increased carbon and climate temperature impacts of that, right? So like there are tipping points where you would say that would also cause a release of carbon and an increase in global temperatures. But for most of the tipping points in that climate dimension, you're probably talking about, for some of them, adding a couple of 0.1, 0.2 degree C for each one. So again, the risks are real, and the risks of climate change increase with temperature, and they don't necessarily increase linearly, right? They can increase non-linearly. So it's not that it's fine that we reach 2 degrees or more than 2 degrees. The point is that there's no temperature where there's no point in us continuing to try to take action, because by doing so, we reduce risks, right? If we go past 2 degrees, it's worth us trying to keep below 2.2 degrees or 2.3 because we reduce the risks at that level. But the notion that we're suddenly going to go from 1.5 to 5 degrees within a decade or a couple of decades is not the case.
Right. And, I obviously wrote a lot about this myself in 6 Degrees. That was a book I published many years ago. But, the emission scenarios that drive you to that very high levels of warming, we could get into the weeds of RCP 8.5 if you want, and so all of this sort of stuff. But, you have to, that has to be a world where we're quadrupling or quintupling coal-fired power burning. And, it's just not going to happen. It's not plausible. We're already seeing probably peaks in coal consumption, even in China. So, the human emissions are probably, Adam, you tell me, but I think looks like they're plateauing now and will probably fall off quite slowly. But there's definitely not going to carry on rising all the way through to 2085.
Globally, emissions are looking like they're approaching a peak. They've kind of been plateauing for around a decade now. They're going up very slowly. But it looks likely that in the next few years, we might hit the peak. It's very hard to predict a peak. And I don't expect that the downward slope is going to be that fast. But I don't think they're going to continue to keep rising for a long time. But there is two dimensions to this. One is the emission scenario, like how much we're emitting. And I think the very, very high scenarios are looking much less likely than they were when you wrote 6 Degrees. So the RCP 8.5 just looks like incredibly unlikely. There's no way that we're going to emit that much. There is another dimension, which is the concerns around what we call the equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is how the climate responds to our emissions. So even if we say we go for this middle emission scenario, we could see a very pessimistic climate response where you might get more warming than you would have anticipated in another scenario. So I think there is now increased concern about higher equilibrium climate sensitivity than there was maybe even just a few years ago. But even there, if you're looking at the distribution of potential temperatures that we end up at on that kind of middle scenario, we're probably heading for around 2.5 to 3 degrees at the moment. Like we need to get that down, but that's at the moment. And then at the tail, like there's probably like a 5% chance that that's actually 4 degrees because we're at a more pessimistic climate sensitivity scenario. But the likelihood of the 4 degree scenario is relatively low, but non-zero.
Right. But equilibrium climate sensitivity isn't the end of the century. It's like several centuries away, right? You've got to melt most of the ice caps and things by that time. So anyway, we've gone down a rabbit hole here because it's interesting on climate. This was basically question one. So like to move on to part two, which is about fossil fuels, there's a question, can we transition to clean energy fast enough? Do most people think that it's just going to be too slow and therefore we're doomed because, the clean energy transition will just take far too long?
Yeah, so the argument there is that if you look through history and look at the energy transitions that societies have gone through. People sometimes frame it as a global energy transition, and I think that's probably wrong. The world has never really gone through a full energy transition, at least all at the same time. Like, that tends to happen in different stages across different fuels in different parts of the world. Like, we've never fully transitioned away from wood, right? Even though many societies rely very little on wood, many people in the world still rely on wood, so we haven't even transitioned away from wood yet. But you tend to see these transitions like from wood to coal or coal to gas, and these tend to take a pretty long period of time, like 70 years or so in many countries. So the argument is that it's going to take us at least 70 years or more to then go through the transition from fossil fuels to lower carbon sources of energy. And therefore, that's just not really compatible with the timescales that we're trying to address climate change on. So that's the argument that's put forward, that we can't possibly do this fast enough. The argument against that is that if you look at the speed at which we can deploy many low carbon sources of energy now, in particular solar and wind, they're growing incredibly fast and much, much faster than we've deployed any energy source in history. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that fossil fuels are a commodity, and the energy technologies that we're deploying today are technologies, and they just have very, very different fundamentals in terms of the economics, in terms of the modularity, in terms of how quickly you can deploy them, especially in different countries without the levels of infrastructure that you might need to build out a fossil fuel network. So I think there are fundamental differences between this transition and many of the transitions that have gone before, which means that I think we can do it faster. It doesn't mean we do it faster, but I think the potential is there for us to do it much, much faster. And there's evidence that many countries are doing so.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about this with Bill McKibben, who's got a new book out called Here Comes the Sun, which is obviously very bullish about solar and, to a lesser extent wind, but solar and batteries, basically driving this enormous clean energy transition, which is well underway in China and also in other countries in the global south. Pakistan is one that gets mentioned. I mean, they're just buying these things dirt cheap and sticking them on the ground, literally just plugging them in all over the place. It does feel like, this is still on the same question, by the way, but it does feel like we've passed a kind of, there's a tipping point. Is there kind of an S-curve shape in terms of how rapidly the sort of solar and batteries aspect of the clean energy transition can happen?
Yeah, many of these technologies follow what's called an S-curve. And the key point about the S-curve is that on the bottom of the slope, it looks like you're making no progress, right? Because it's growing extremely, extremely slowly. And I think that's the position that we've been in, which I think has made a lot of people very, very pessimistic about our ability to do this, because they think, well, we've been trying this for a while and it's just getting nowhere. But then you start to reach, as you say, the kind of inflection point where things really take off, and then you get very, very fast growth. And then it tails off towards the top. Once you're reaching, 80, 90%, it starts to slow down until you get this gradual rise up to 100%. But I think many countries are around that kind of inflection point. Some past it. Like, if you look at the deployment of electric vehicles in some countries, like, it's just been incredibly rapid. Like, Norway follows a perfect S-curve and is now 96% of new cars in Norway are electric. China, more than half of new car sales in China are electric. And you go back to 2020, which seems really not that long ago, it was 6%, right? So these curves can go really, really rapidly and actually catch a lot of people off guard, because they are still looking at the gentle slope at the bottom until it gets to the inflection point.
A lot of people are just out of date on
Yeah.
a lot of this stuff. So while we're on renewable energy, this is part 3. Yeah, I thought I'd go to question 15. What happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? It's the classic question, isn't it? Do they not realize that it gets dark at night and that there won't be any, What's your answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, the variability of renewables is very clearly a problem. And like I should say, what I want to make very, very clear in this book is I'm not saying that none of these are issues, right? I'm making very clear these are actually often issues that we need to address. And the deployment of these technologies, or the solutions we deploy, often will generate new problems in and of themselves, right? But we are capable of tackling those problems. But when it comes to the variability of renewables, the key point there is that we need to fill in gaps at different timescales, right? So you need to fill in gaps of minutes to hours. You need to fill in gaps from hours to days. And then in some countries, you need to somehow fill in the gap between when you don't have wind and you have very, very low sun for, can be weeks or more. And the solution to those different timescales is slightly different, right? So in the very short timescales, standard lithium-ion batteries do very, very well. right? And I think many countries in the world will actually get extremely far with just solar, wind, and batteries. And they might need a little extra of something to fill in the gap.
But when you say very, very far, you mean like 90+%
yeah,
of their energy?
Generally, countries closer to the equator that have better sunlight than elsewhere. But I think many countries can get pretty close to 90% or more from just solar, wind, and batteries. And the batteries are very good for these minutes to hours storage. Then you get to the hours to days, and the UK is a very, very good example of this. We wouldn't be able to do wind, solar, and batteries year round. But there are a range of solutions there, right? So you can mix it with other low carbon sources. You can do nuclear, you can do hydro, you could utilize geothermal. There are other forms of storage. So iron redox is becoming very popular. There's thermal battery storage, which is becoming popular. What's really underrated, I think, is long range transmission. It's always windy or sunny somewhere. So if you can build very strong alliances with other countries and have this long range transmission, you can often fill in the gaps. Hydro storage is obviously a very, very cheap and easy one to do in many places. There's hydrogen as a fallback. I think hydrogen is relatively expensive as a storage solution, but might be needed. But the key point is that we have these options across these different timescales. And for a given country, it's really about picking the correct one based on the energy mix and energy supplies that they have. And that's the key point there, is that there's no just one silver bullet for every country. It really depends on the local context. But there are options there. And this is not an excuse to not do this, because it is a very solvable problem.
Yes. I mean, one of the objections, and you hear this a lot from the pro-nuclear crowd, is that renewables take a lot of land, and particularly if you have to overbuild, like build a lot more solar and a lot more wind than you're going to need, because you're going to have to charge batteries, or it's going to stop for a number of days or weeks or whatever. So this is, well, what is this question? This is question 18. Won't we run out of land to use solar panels and wind turbines? Like how land extensive or land intensive are renewables?
I mean, the nuclear crowd are correct. If you wanted to just build an energy supply using as little land as possible, nuclear would be a great option. Right? You have the chart in the book, and nuclear is extremely land efficient. So if you wanted to land spare as much as you can, you should go nuclear. But I think the notion that our landscapes are going to be completely overrun with renewables, or we'll run out of land to do renewables, is just not true. Like for solar, for most countries, if you wanted to power the grid predominantly through solar, you're talking about percentage points of land in most countries.
What do you mean, like 2 or 3% sort of thing?
Yeah, it obviously depends on the context and how much sun, but yeah. So in some countries it could be 2 to 3%. In less sunny climates, it might be a bit more. But you're probably you're talking about less than 10% percentage points of land. Obviously, you can utilize rooftops, and that will reduce total land use a bit. And then when it comes to wind, I think two things to distinguish here. One is the land footprint, the amount of land you're using for the wind, and then the visual footprint. And I think those are very, very different things, right? So most wind farms are built in very rural areas that are often farms, like actual agricultural farms. And the actual land use of the wind farm is extremely low, right? It's just the turbine going into the ground, and then if there's roads that need to be built to connect it. The actual physical land use there is low, and the farmer can still farm between the turbines perfectly fine. So the total land use there is extremely, extremely small, like less than solar, like less than percentage points. What most people mean is the visual footprint, right? So it's drawing a huge perimeter around the field that has the wind turbines in it. It's the turbines in their line of vision. And there the footprint can be pretty high. Like you're talking about well over 10%, 10 to 20% in many countries for a reasonable amount of wind power as the visual footprint. But the total land use is relatively small.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, referring to the conversation I had with Bill McKibben on this very podcast, I think the area of land that's used for corn ethanol, I don't know if you remember the stats for this offhand, but which is a very inefficient use of land. Just that would produce enough solar to run the entire country, right?
Yeah, I did some back of the envelopes on this, and if you covered the land the US currently uses for corn ethanol, which is to produce a really, really small amount of biofuels in its car supply. It could power the US 2 to 3 times over. So it basically could decarbonize the US. The US wouldn't go fully solar plus batteries. That would be a bad idea. But the total amount of electricity produced is like 2 to 3 times how much the US currently consumes. So it's just huge amounts of electricity that could be produced on that land that's currently not being used for very much and is doing very, very little climate-wise.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, renewables is almost a rounding error compared to the big land use, which is
agriculture.
Yeah, and livestock in particular.
Yeah, I mean, half of the world's habitable land is used for farming. So a renewable energy is incredibly small compared to that. And what's key is that, again, like often you're not using the land per se, you're often implementing renewable energy technologies on existing land that's still being used for that previous purpose. So the notion that once you put renewable energy on that land, you can't use it for anything except renewable energy production is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I've got solar panels in one of our fields, and, well, I could have sheep around them if I didn't hate sheep, which I do. But as it is, they're kind of a wildflower meadow, so it's still improvement for biodiversity. But hey, we should move on. Part 4 is nuclear power. I mean, there's a number of questions here which, people will be very familiar with. Isn't it dangerous? Doesn't it take too long to build? And I thought we'd look at, isn't nuclear power too expensive? This is question 23 in your book. Because I saw some figures for Sizewell C, which is the new big light water reactor plant, which is proposed. And I think they've made the final investment decision. So they're actually going to go ahead and build this thing now. But they were talking like £100 billion if you include the long-term financing and stuff. I mean, that's just unbelievable in terms of expenditure. There's no way you're going to build loads and loads of these things at that kind of price. So there's the question. Isn't nuclear power too expensive?
Yeah, it is too expensive. It's pretty much what I say in the book. For me, the Achilles heel of nuclear is just speed and cost. You can't build this stuff quickly, and you cannot build it at a cost that's competitive with the marginal cost of renewables. I would caveat that by saying that some countries are building nuclear relatively quickly, right? China and South Korea, for example, are still building nuclear. They're building these plants in maybe 6 or 7 years, which is not too bad. But the point is that the speed, and I'll come on to the cost, the speed there is nothing compared to the speed by which they're deploying renewables. If you look at solar and wind deployment in China relative to nuclear, and to be clear, China's doing best on nuclear in the world. It's a drop in the ocean.
Is it like, I don't know, do you know the gigawattage sort of off by hand?
Not off the top of my head, but it's extremely, extremely small compared to the rollout of solar and wind.
Right.
So my perspective there is that nuclear for most countries is not going to make up the bulk of electricity. It's just not going to be deployed quickly enough and cheaply enough to do so. But I do still think that nuclear can play some role. And that's because in some countries, like we discussed with the sun not always shining, the wind not always blowing, getting the final 10% or 20%, depending on where you are, of low carbon electricity just could be expensive, right? Like if you take the UK, for example, I think the UK can get to 80%, 85% low carbon electricity, mostly with solar and wind, pretty cheaply. But I think often the last 10 to 15% is a squeeze. And could be relatively expensive. And even though nuclear is still quite expensive, it might be the least expensive of the alternative options that we have. So I think nuclear for many countries could fill in part of that gap, even though I don't think it's going to be the biggest source in most countries.
We talked about electric cars already a bit, because you mentioned about how rapid the adoption rates have been in Norway and also in China now, where more than 50% of new cars are electric. You've got some. I mean, some of these questions that you address here are quite sort of zombie myths, I think. Are the electric cars just as bad for the climate as petrol cars? I remember various op-eds by famous people in UK newspapers making that case a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how widely held that is, but do you find people still think that?
Yeah.
Wow. So what's the answer then?
The answer is no. Like an electric car is better. Like the point that always comes up is, there's 2 points that come up. One is that it takes a huge amount of energy to build the battery in the car in the first place, and that's much, much worse than a petrol car. And to some extent, that's true. Like it does take more energy, and there are higher carbon emissions in the production of the car, even though I think that will come down with time, and we've actually started to see that come down. One of the challenge is that often people trying to make this case, as we said earlier, will cite really old data, really out-of-date data when the carbon intensity of the production of these cars was extremely high. And then the other argument is, yeah, but most countries run their electricity on coal, and they'll take China or India as the example, and therefore running your electric car on coal electricity surely can't be better for the climate, and it actually is. It's not hugely better if you have a very, very coal-intensive electricity mix, but it is actually still better. And of course, most countries don't run, or no country runs on 100% coal power. And the point is that we're trying to decarbonize our electricity grid. So your electric car will get better and better over time as we decarbonize.
Yeah, I think people don't appreciate, and this comes up in the primary energy use stats about, in the fossil fuel age. People don't appreciate how much more efficient electric cars are at converting energy into work done, and namely moving somewhere, right? Because in internal combustion engine cars, I think it's like 2/3 gets wasted as heat. So that's where, 2/3 of your petrol or your diesel's going. Whereas for EVs, I mean, it's a much more efficient, isn't it, in terms of how much electricity actually goes to move the thing?
Yeah, like as a kind of rule of thumb, in a petrol car, you're probably losing 70 to 80% of the energy as waste, and only 20 to 30% is actually turning the wheels. And in an electric car, it's basically the inverse of that. So you're wasting around 20 to 30% and you're getting 70 to 80% turning the wheels and moving you to where you want to go. So per mile driven, your electric car is maybe 3 times more efficient than a petrol car, which again is like one of the fallacies, as you said, is that, and this is broader than just electric vehicles, but I think as for the energy transition as a whole, one, moving from fossil fuels to low carbon energy, and 2, trying to move from our current system to a more electrified system, is that you get all of these efficiency benefits. So when people make the argument, they show this, huge stack of how much energy we currently use and say, oh no, you can't replace all of that with renewables or low carbon electricity. And the point is that we will need much less electricity to get the same societal benefits, which in this case is the amount of miles you're driving. You just need much, much less energy than you currently do with a petrol car.
By way of an aside, did David Mackay get this right or wrong in his sustainability? His book without hot air, because he had a big stack and the whole thing looked really, really difficult to do with renewables, but it seems actually not to be that difficult after all.
Yeah, like I was reflecting a bit on David Mackay's book when I was writing this one, and a key point there, which will also be the case with my book, is it's really hard to write these types of books because the stuff changes over time, right? So you're writing a static book, but this stuff moves quickly. So in a few years, it's kind of out of date. In David Mackay's case, was it 2007 or 2008?
Yeah, really short time ago.
Yeah. On this, no, I think he was right. He was very clear on the electrification angle. I'm not sure if it made it into the stack, but he was definitely seemed quite bullish on electric cars and electric heat pumps because of the efficiency gains, which isn't a fault of his because it was very unclear at the time that electric cars would actually become a thing, right? So he was probably quite pessimistic that it would actually break through from a cost perspective and a technological perspective. But I think on the physics of the efficiency gains, I think he got it.
Yeah, it's amazing looking back. I mean, I've been in this business because I'm a lot older than you for a lot longer. And I remember George Monbiot writing this book called Heat. I think it was in also 2007, 2008, thereabouts. And we all had to travel by bus and bike and walking. Electric cars weren't even a thing. So in, a decade and a half, a bit longer, it really goes to show what technological innovations can do in terms of the clean energy transition.
Yeah, I mean, and they also feature in the book, we all now know the massive underestimations people have made about the drop in the cost of batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, but also about the rate of deployment. It surprised a lot of people how rapidly this stuff changed.
Yeah, so what about heat pumps then? This is part 7, heating and cooling. People are there's been a lot of controversy in Germany about heat pumps, in the UK as well. I mean, they are quite expensive. I put one in our house, an air source heat pump, and it's many thousands of pounds, which is a lot more expensive than your average gas boiler. So I guess that's, actually, question 39, aren't heat pumps much more expensive than a gas boiler? What's the answer to that?
The answer is yes, they are. Yeah, the heat pumps are fantastic technology. probably the best weapon or solution we have to decarbonize heating. But again, I think the Achilles heel for heat pumps is not the running cost, but the upfront cost of installing one. So when it comes to running cost, heat pumps in most countries are cheaper to run than gas boilers are. And again, this comes back to the huge efficiency gains you get with this electrification. The gains are less good in the UK because our electricity prices are very high, right? So what's going to determine how much you save from installing a heat pump is really about the price ratio of gas to electricity. And in the UK, that ratio is extremely poor. So the UK is really losing out, other countries less so, and you get higher savings. But the big challenge, I think, is the upfront cost of installing a heat pump. So in the UK, the average cost is around £12,500. As you say, you can install a gas boiler for £2,000 or £3,000. So there's a £10,000 gap there, which people are not going to pay, or most people are not going to pay. The government does offer a £9,000 or £9,500 grant. Even then, you're just about making up that difference for some households. If it's a more complex build, they'll still have to pay a bit extra. But the key point is that because the government is paying £9,500 in a grant doesn't mean that that's free. Like someone's paying for it. It's just not necessarily the consumer directly. So I think the upfront economics of heat pumps are the biggest challenge.
Is that going to change? I mean, the Chinese are now, it used to cost £50,000 or to buy an EV, electric vehicle. And the Chinese are now, these BYD cars, they're selling them out for $10,000 or something. I mean, do you think heat pumps can go in the same direction and just become a lot cheaper?
I think they can become cheaper, but probably not at the same rate and to the same extent as batteries or electric cars. I think probably the learning curve there is much, much shallower than it is for batteries or electric cars. So I think the prices will come down somewhat, but I would be highly skeptical if you saw them coming down to the point where they're without a grant competitive with the upfront cost of a gas boiler. I think the upfront cost for a heat pump will just be higher than a gas boiler for a long time. One of the potential benefits, which I think is actually becoming increasingly important, even in climates like the UK, is the fact that a heat pump can also operate as an air conditioning unit.
I didn't know that. So you can kind of just reverse it?
Yeah, you can do that. I think there is some weird caveat with the UK's grant system for the heat pumps, right? That you're not allowed to use it for. Right. But I think for many people, that would be the incentive that would tip them over the edge, right? I think with increasingly hot summers and heat waves, maybe a bit less so in Scotland, but like definitely in the south of England, I think this is becoming a problem. And I think for many people, they will very soon consider getting an AC unit. And if they can get a heat pump that operates as a heat pump and an air conditioning unit in the same unit, that would greatly increase the attractiveness of that option. So I think that's one area where trying to promote the dual use of these would be really crucial.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to part 8 we're on now, which is food. We talked a bit about land. I was quite surprised with this question 41 that some people think that there's not enough land for everyone to go plant-based. I thought everyone knew that going plant-based was a lot less land.
Oh, no, they don't know.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the argument for why we use so much grazing land is that we need to use that land to produce food, because if we didn't, then we wouldn't have enough food. So the argument is that we're using, and it's true, like a lot of the land that's used as grazing land is not of a high enough quality for us to grow crops on. So the argument is that because that's not good enough quality to grow crops, we therefore have to use it to produce animal products. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to produce enough food. So I don't think most people know that fact.
Yes, I mean, I guess it's true, but that land can be used for rewilding and for, bringing back.
Yeah, but we have to use it for humans always.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, the way to get away from this dramatic use of land for livestock is meat substitutes, right? And there's a lot of pushback on, alt proteins, meat substitutes now because of this notion that they're ultra processed, and that makes them unhealthy. And you've got a question on that. So what's your take on that issue?
I mean, I just have major issues with the catch-all label of ultra-processed, and I think it has very much become equivalent in most people's minds to junk food. or unhealthy or even in some cases unsafe or dangerous. So you have this categorization system that categorizes foods based on how processed they are. And you have this label ultra processed, and it includes everything from Coca-Cola to donuts to supermarket bread to Beyond Meat burger. And as if these products in any way are nutritionally equivalent, just makes absolutely no sense.
It's literally apples and oranges, isn't it?
It's literally apples and oranges, right? And of course, the equivalence is that the natural unprocessed food is best, and anything that's processed is bad, and ultra processed is extremely, extremely bad. And when you look at the research on this, it just doesn't stack up. Again, it is often because all of these foods are thrown together and under this one label. So you'll find studies which are true, which find that people that have a higher intake of ultra-processed foods overall tend to have poorer health outcomes. And I can absolutely believe that. But the notion that that somehow applies to every single ultra-processed food item in that whole category just doesn't make sense. Often when you drill down, it tends to be most strongly correlated with one, sugary drinks like Coca-Cola, and two, processed meats, right? Like the key point is that many of the meats that people would be replacing are also defined as highly processed or ultra processed.
So a meat sausage is also a UPF, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
A lot of the more recent research tends to find that the correlations there are strongest between particular groups of items within the ultra-processed category, not the whole category as a whole. So I think this notion that, Beyond Meat burger or veggie sausages are somehow much worse than standard processed meat is not in line with the research.
So just to be clear, are you better off eating a Beyond Meat burger or an actual beef burger? And I'm not talking about the environment, I'm not talking about animal welfare, but literally in terms of the human health issue.
The research would suggest the Beyond Meat burger. I think this also goes in the opposite direction where people overstate, I think, the health benefits of a fully plant-based diet. You often see lots of studies coming out saying vegans, vegetarians, etc., live much better health outcomes. I think the problem there is that a lot of these studies are correlational. So often the types of people that have a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet tend to be correlated with, one, they're probably higher income, they're often younger, they probably are more conscious of other parts of their health beyond, so they probably are less likely to smoke, they're probably more likely to exercise. So often these correlational studies, I think, are not as clear-cut as people make out. But I would probably say that the Beyond Meat burger is probably marginally better for your health than the beef burger.
Yeah, I don't know how they can ever do these studies because there's so many confounding factors, like you say. And, people aren't lab rats. You can't make people eat a single thing for, 20 years or something. You might need to find out whether it's going to cause cancer. Right. So I guess all the studies here are correlational, right? I mean, they're all trying to look at cohorts of people and try and identify dietary differences and then see whether there's health outcomes and then outcome differences and then correct for all of the confounding factors. But I guess the devil's always in the detail with these things, particularly with the correction.
You can do, most of them are correlational. You can do shorter term ones where you take a group of people and you put them on this very, very strict diet and see how they respond in shorter term health outcomes like weight or cholesterol levels. But yes, these longer term ones are nearly always correlational.
Okay, let's move on to part 9. And I actually want to take a couple of questions from this because they are the ones that I still don't know the answers to. Producer Rob is smiling like I should know the answer to everything. But no, I don't know the answer to this one, which is question 45. Will we ever be able to produce low carbon cement?
I'm quite optimistic about this one.
Yeah.
I think we now, we can, right? The key thing is going to be cost. Can we produce low carbon cement at a cost that's competitive with current cement, or will we have to pay much, much more for low carbon cement? I think is the real question. And the point I also make in the book is that this is in the section called the hard-to-abate sectors. As I say in the book, I think people often equate this with impossible to abate. These are the sectors that we just have no idea how to do. And I think that was maybe true 10 years ago, but I think we've actually made quite a bit of progress in the last 10 years where I think we're now at the stage where we actually know how we could do this. It's about cost, right? So there are kind of 3 key ways I think we can do this. The first one is you won't get zero carbon cement, but you can dramatically reduce the amount of CO2 you produce from cement. And that's actually just by changing the ratio of the amount of cement in your concrete. right? So to get concrete, you take cement and you mix it with water and sand and gravel and stuff. And currently we have pretty high, especially in Europe and North America, we have pretty high concentrations of cement in our concrete. And actually you could probably reduce that and still have the same strength of material and the same kind of safety standards. And having less cement in there would reduce your emissions.
I think cement's actually quite big in terms of sector of emissions. Isn't it bigger than aviation?
Yeah, it's like 7 or 8%.
Yeah. When people say to me, why are you flying to New York? I'm like, well, why are you still using cement in your house? But it doesn't seem to have quite the same salience, does it? But I always thought that with cement, it was the fundamental chemistry, right? You take calcium carbonate, you reduce it to calcium oxide, which means...
Calcium oxide, which means you have CO2 as a byproduct from the process.
So what do you do about that?
So if you just use less cement, then you just reduce the amount of CO2 you produce, right? So that's one option. The second option is carbon capture and storage. So you capture the CO2 directly from the process. When it comes to cost competitiveness, I think we can reduce that somewhat, but you're never going to make it the same price as cement production without carbon capture and storage, right? When you add CCS, you just add on a price, right? So you're probably talking about maybe 50% or so premium on a carbon capture and storage cement using that. And then the final method, which I'm probably most optimistic about, is rather than using limestone as the feedstock, you can use, say, calcium silicate. And calcium silicate is in basically one of our most abundant rocks on Earth. So there's no risk of us running out of this stuff. The process doesn't produce CO2 at the end of it, right? You're taking calcium silicate rather than CaCO3 limestone or calcium carbonate. So you're not producing CO2 as a byproduct. And I think there are a number of startups working on that, and I'm like pretty optimistic that that's the solution that wins here.
How about steel? And this is question 46. What about low carbon steel? I mean, again, it's a chemistry issue, isn't it? You take iron oxide, you reduce it by putting coke in there, so you put carbon in there, and that takes off the oxygen in the form of CO2, right?
Mm-hmm. So again, steel, we can do it. It's just about how much we can close the price premium and how much more we're willing to pay, if any, for low carbon steel. So rather than using coke, you can use...
Coke meaning not Coca-Cola, but actual coal.
No, actual coke, yeah. You can basically electrify the process, or you can incorporate hydrogen as a different feedstock. Again, the process we can do, the fundamental problem is the cost. Like, you automatically add some cost on there. I think currently the premium with some of these methods is around 25%. So you're adding 25% to the price tag. One of the points I make in the book is that 25% for many products is a big, hefty price tag to add on. For some products, because the steel is actually a relatively small component of the final price, actually, if you were to filter that through to the consumer, they actually might not notice that much, or it might not make a big difference to the final price of the product. And that's also the case with cement. The cost of the cement for your house is a really, really small fraction of the cost of your house, right? Most of it's other materials, it's the construction, it's the workers. A pretty small percentage of the final cost of your house is actually cement. Therefore, even if you were to increase it by 25%, the increased cost of your house would be really, really small. And I think for many products that use steel, it's the same. So for a car, the premium on a car that uses low carbon steel might not actually be that much in total terms, even if the steel is 25% more expensive.
All right. So what about aviation and shipping? I mean, that's another really, really tough one, isn't it? You can't electrify these easily. The batteries are too heavy to get off the ground. So is there there's a lot of talk about sustainable aviation fuels, but those tend to come from biological material, and that's limited and so on. Is there a silver bullet for aviation in particular?
Oh, no. There's no silver bullet.
Damn.
No. So for both shipping and for aviation, I'm pretty confident that for short haul flights or shorter journeys, that batteries will get there. Like, they're already getting there. There are ferries now running on batteries. You get short haul flights, like really pretty small planes with batteries. But I think there's still a lot of potential for battery technologies, such that I think that short-haul aviation is possible. Long-haul aviation will need some alternative, and it will probably either be biofuels or hydrogen. They both have their significant downsides, and I think those downsides are pretty unavoidable. So for hydrogen, just the main cost is the amount of electricity you need to produce to generate that amount of green hydrogen. It's pretty hefty. If I can recall, I think it's maybe 25% of our current global electricity demand we would have to add on top just to produce enough hydrogen. So that's the major downside there. And of course, that has knock-on impacts on price. So the cost of flying would go up. And then for the other alternative there is biofuels. And there the big cost is just land. So there's a lot of hype about vegetable oils because Virgin Atlantic did that transatlantic flight using vegetable oils, but there's just nowhere near enough waste vegetable oils. The focus was that there was waste fats and oils, and there's just absolutely not enough waste fats and oils, even if we gathered it all up for it to power flights. Like, I think even if we gathered all of the world's waste oils and fats, it would be less than 10% of aviation demand, maybe 5%. So we would need to look to alternatives. So we'd need to look to either just using directly vegetable oils, or you could use cereals, but it just comes at a really, really high land cost.
These are like corn that they're using for ethanol in the US Corn Belt.
Yeah, you could use corn. I think I estimated that if we were to power global aviation with corn, we would need land the size of India to produce that amount of crops, which is a lot.
That is a lot. I remember sitting down with Richard Branson, of all people, back in, I think it was like 2010, and he told me personally that Virgin Atlantic would be fully running on biofuels by 2020. I even got this on film. I don't know what I've done with the footage, but I don't think that ever happened, did it?
No. They did that one very publicized flight with the vegetable oils. I think Richard Branson was on it. I think he was very chuffed with it. But yeah, no, decarbonization of aviation is going extremely slowly.
I mean, it might even be better, and I'm skipping here to part 10, to just use goddamn fossil fuels for aviation and sequester the carbon some other way and just take it back out of the atmosphere. Can we solve climate change without carbon dioxide removal? But is that an option? I mean, it would depend on the relative price and scalability of that, but is CDR a big thing?
There are definitely proponents that for aviation, that would just be the most cost-effective way to do it, is just to continue using jet fuel and to sequester the carbon some other way. With that, there's always the politics of it as well, though, right? So, like, even if you're to decide that that's the most cost-effective way to do this, and I think even if you were to prove that you were doing this in a very permanent storage in a very permanent way, I think there would still be political and social ramifications of the fact that aviation was not decarbonizing in the sense that it was switching away from fossil fuels. But yeah, I think that is one option for aviation that might be most cost effective.
It's a bit like a return to offsetting, though, which got very badly damaged by, political concern. You know, the moral calculus of offsetting never felt good. I remember a friend of mine had set up an offsetting company, and one of the products they were selling was, literally peasants in Bangladesh using treadle pumps to reduce their diesel consumption from diesel pumps. So they'll actually be, treading these things to get the water up out of the borehole to water the crops. And the idea of like people flying in business class overhead while these peasants were using treadle pumps to reduce their diesel consumption, which just felt morally outrageous, even if it did reduce CO2. And that was sort of happened to offsetting as a whole, didn't it?
Yeah, there's that angle to it. But then there's also just the fact that I think a lot of offsetting programs were just not good and actually didn't make any actual carbon reductions. Yes, one is like the moral ickiness of it. And then two is this that it actually just wasn't reducing emissions or offsetting emissions in the first place. Yeah.
And question 50, which you've left to the very end, obviously, is the issue of solar geoengineering, which we've done a couple of episodes on. So our audience will be fairly familiar with what this is. And in fact, your question is, isn't solar geoengineering too risky? What's your take?
Yeah, I felt like I had to include something on solar geoengineering because I get asked about it a lot, but it was quite hard to distill into a single question, I'll admit. The argument put forward for solar geoengineering is often that it is actually an incredibly cheap way for us to reduce global temperatures, right? If you look purely at the upfront or the very visible cost of that, that's completely true. Like the estimates for how much it would take for us to reduce warming by half a degree are incredibly small relative to the amount that we're currently paying to transition our whole economies away from fossil fuels to low carbon energy sources. I think the key caveat to that is that we don't sufficiently know the true costs if you were to factor in the risk of something going wrong. So my take on it would be that I'm not someone that completely shuts the door and say we should never touch this ever, but I'm also not let's go out there and deploy it right now because we need it right now and it's cheap to do. I'm very much kind of in a middle position where I think we should actually be researching, putting small amounts of funding into researching this. I think for two reasons. One, if we were to decide collectively, and collectively is a very charged term here because I don't think it would be in any way a kind of unanimous collective decision to do it. But if there was some decision that, we actually really do need to deploy to reduce temperatures, I would hope that we would really know what the consequences of that would be. And two, because I think there are scenarios where, because it is relatively cheap to deploy, some country or some small collection of countries could just decide, no, we just won't take any more warming, our populations are suffering, and therefore they will just deploy it. And in that scenario, I would really like us to understand what the consequences of that might be. So I'm very much in this mid position of, I don't think we should rule it out completely, but we shouldn't also just rush in and start deploying this stuff. I think we should invest small amounts in research.
So that was question 50. You mentioned earlier on about how difficult it is to keep something like a book, which obviously needs to have a shelf life by definition, up to date. I would recommend that people rush out and buy it straight away because
before it's out of date.
Before it gets out of date. Like, what are you going to do? I mean, a book isn't a live thing. I mean, obviously you've got the websites, you've got Our World in Data, which covers so many different questions. I mean, I use it all the time. You've got your Substack sustainability by numbers, wasn't it? What can you do to keep a book up to date? Can you do some online presence for it, or have you tried to answer the questions in a way which is going to have a longer shelf life, or what?
I think one thing I think it's hard, but I think one thing to my, I guess, benefit is that often the stuff I'm saying is trending in a particular direction. I think we'll continue to trend in that direction. What I'm saying about the pretty rapid rollout of electric vehicles, in many cases, the curve continues to go up, right? So if I was to give the stats for China, saying, China's deployment of electric vehicles has been rising rapidly. This year it was a third. And then next year it was 50%. Like, yeah, you'd be 1 year out of date, but you get the general point, right? And you might need to go and check the latest number, but your general point is that electric vehicles are taking off rapidly in China. So I think there are a lot of trends like that are pointing in a particular direction at a pretty rapid rate. And therefore, what I'm saying, even though the number will be 1 or 2 years out of date, the general message is sound and hopefully won't be out of date. But this stuff, because it moves quickly, like I'm always covering it on my newsletter and blog and doing small updates and stuff. So that's probably like the best I can do. And then like you, I'll need to write you did like an update of 6 degrees, didn't you? So I'll need to come out with that in the future.
I did, and so that was like 15 years further on, and we'd already moved on a degree by then. So like we were a chapter further forward. But that's why I mentioned about David Mackay's book, because I messed up the title early, but it's Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air.
Yeah.
I mean, and people have contacted me many times, and also Ramesh, David's widow, about maybe doing an update. And actually, I actually think it is of its time, and it was incredibly inspiring and meaningful to a lot of people when it came out. So I think it can just stay as it is. What do you think?
I've also been approached to do an update. I think everyone they're working in this area because people are because it was such a good book. I think people are desperate for an update of it. I would love a dynamic version of his book that had been updated, but I also really like just going back to the version he wrote, and I find it interesting to just think like this was how everyone was then thinking about energy at this point in time. And I think it's actually quite different to how we're thinking about things today in many ways. And I think that contrast over what's not a huge amount of time is super interesting and really valuable, right? Probably people might listen to this conversation that we're having 10 years from now and think we're just talking absolute nonsense because stuff has moved on so quickly. And I think there's value to that rather than somehow trying to erase it and make it exactly how people think about energy now.
I mean, maybe we're a bit more hopeful than we were. I mean, David was quite sort of pessimistic, and you call your book a hopeful guide. Is that because, it's the cynics and the pessimists who tend to get the data wrong? Or why are you pushing back more against the pessimists than maybe the sort of techno-optimists?
I think there's a bit of trying to ground the hyper-optimistic techno-optimists. I think I try to be clear and honest as I can in the answers and not overstate that somehow these are like perfect solutions that are going to fix everything with no downsides and, it'll cost us no money and there's no barriers to us doing that. I want to be very clear about what the barriers are so that we can overcome them. So I also try not to be like so Pollyannish about this and think that it's just going to be easy for us to make this a reality. The reason I call it a hopeful guide is because as I said, I framed it as 50 questions. But for many people, it's basically 50 reasons why this is totally impossible for us to do this. And I don't think there's really any of the questions where the answer is, there's absolutely no chance of us doing this. There's many of the questions where the answer is, we can do this right now and we can do this right now cheaply and we just need to go for it. And there are some parts of it which are harder, but again, are like, we have several options here. Those options are getting better. I'm sure in the next 20 to 30 years, we can work this out. So I think that's why it's hopeful. To me, there's no deal breakers on the answers that suggest that this is an impossible feat for us to do. I think many people think that it's an impossible feat for us to do.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, actually. And I, again, can't recommend this highly enough. I really enjoyed reading it. And I insist and highly recommend that people rush out and buy it straight away. Have you got another project in the offing? Or are you sound like you've already have several full-time jobs.
Yeah, I'm trying to calm down for a bit and not jump into something new. It's a full-time job just trying to keep up with how fast this stuff is moving. So
good. Well, enjoy the warm temperatures in Edinburgh, and best of luck with all of the other work that you're doing. And thanks again for joining us. And yeah, come back when you've got your next book.
I will. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.